Hey guys, welcome to the Noise Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about some fun stuff. I think this topic isn't talked about as much as I think that I would like it to be talked about, and it's creative direction. So specifically, we're going to be talking about what a creative director does, what I've done in the past for Facer as a creative director, and kind of go off the beaten path a little bit and talk about like all the nuances of doing that too. So with me here is the co-host, Louis. Louis, want to introduce
Hey, how are
yourself?
you?
Good, good. How you doing?
I'm good actually. This is something you don't know, but today's actually my birthday.
It's your birthday. Happy birthday,
It's my
Louis.
birthday today, and I wouldn't want to be spending it any other way.
All right, cool, man. Doing a podcast on Louis' birthday. This is his
I
present
know.
to himself.
It makes it very special.
Excellent, excellent.
Right, let's dive in.
Yeah, let's do
Let's
it.
dive into the world of creative directorship. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we've got many more people who have had such a broad experience to that as a practice as you, especially when you've sort of worked for agencies, you've worked in-house, you've worked for massive companies, little companies,
Mm-hmm.
and you've sort of seen various industries as well. And I
Yeah.
think to kick things off, really, I'd like to get your own definition about what it is a creative director. What do they do?
So, and this is funny because I went into this role thinking that a creative director did a very specific set of things, but that was definitely not true. So, I think it depends on where you're at, what company you're at. It's going to depend on like the gamut of things that they give you, right? So, if you're at a smaller company, I imagine creative directors are kind of like touching all of the things, right? They're going to be touching the brand, they're going to be touching like all the app design stuff. If you're an app studio, if you're more on the creative ad side or the media side, there might be checking out some of your advertisements, the videos that you're making, commercials, whatever that might be. But I feel like it's different everywhere you go. So in the past, I used to work on cars, and the creative director there was he did a little bit. I mean, it was more of like overseeing things, and it was like very specific to just that project too. But like I said earlier, if you go to a smaller company, you might be touching more things like the brand. You're gonna be touching like all sorts of different things too, and everybody kind of has like a different definition of it too. So it's pretty interesting too. I went into it thinking it was gonna be one thing when it's really depends on where you go.
That sounds very similar to almost every single job title in the design industry, in that I could be a UI designer working on an app or a game or a website or an e-commerce store, and it's, as you said, nuanced according to where you are. For me, I think creative directorship is someone who does have that oversight about strategy and not just about the pixels on the screen. And
Sure.
they're the kind of person at the back supporting the team and saying, we're going to hit this goal and we're going to do it this way. I'm trusting you guys to get it done. Is that something you see yourself being naturally good at, or have you struggled with that as a something to be able to do?
It's funny because I think that personality wise, I'm a little bit more introverted than a lot of creative directors or art directors. So I had to learn a lot of like the social side of skills, is like how to communicate, how when you have interns, how do you kind of give them the correct direction, how do
Yeah,
you make sure that they're satisfied in their role that they're doing too, because depending again on where you're at, what company you're at, sometimes that falls on you, sometimes that falls on your boss, sometimes it falls on the CEO. It really depends. So it's really interesting when you look at like the different like skill sets that you have to have. So you do have to have that like 10,000 foot view of the entire brand, like
yeah.
the entire app or the company, and you have to have these higher goals, kind of like you were saying, where you have to look at it from a very high level and then kind of like let it trickle down. So you do touch a lot of things. So you might kind of help out with the brand strategy or like the actual app strategy itself. How do you acquire users? How you're going to do that creatively? Where do you go to acquire users? Where do you go to acquire more employees? It's like you're kind of like weaved into like all parts of like the creative process, and that's
Yeah.
the way I like it.
I'd like to do a bit of a dive into the Facer story and wonder and work out whether all this direction and sort of guidelines and brand voice was established before you arrived, or is that something you had to work a lot on with yourself?
Yeah, so they basically what they had was they had an app that they bought from a college student, and then what what they did was they converted it basically into like a bigger app. They did a lot of advertising, they did a lot of pushing. So there was like a vague brand there already. It was really weak when I got there, and so when I came in, that was like one of my first tasks was basically to rebrand the app to make it look a little bit fresher, to make it not look so aggressive, because it was very like male oriented, and we wanted to try to
Yeah.
go towards like the female market. So we softened up the logo. We basically went through like a ton of iterations. We had a bunch of different designers doing them. We outsourced a few. I tried to throw in a few into the bucket too. And then we finally had, like a third person kind of come in too. So we had him do some designs. That was ultimately the one that we went with.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was, we definitely started out kind of like, didn't really have a brand vision for it just yet. The CEO was really, really great in that he kind of like trusted us to kind of go in and like rebrand everything. And he knew that brand was like a very strong thing, something that we did have to push on too. So that was nice too, because a lot of times you can go into companies and they don't want to push that.
I was just about to say that exact thing, in that a lot of companies unfortunately don't value the quality of the brand or value design as a practice in general. And a lot of the job I've found in my history is actually just coming up with a case and justifying why you think we need to be working on. Why do we need to redesign the website? And you need to come up and say, well, in order for us to meet this target, we need to be able to look a certain way. And customers actually do respond to that. So have you
Absolutely.
had a lot of experience, not necessarily just with Facer, but in your broader career, about having to become that sort of point person for why design is important?
Oh, absolutely. I feel like, I mean, I'm sure you can kind of relate with this, is you're constantly trying to convince people that you need these like really fine details in the design, right? Like when I was, my first part of my career was like a lot of like convincing people that we needed, UX designers, that UX was really like a thing we needed, especially in gaming. I feel like UX is kind of like, it's like the last step. It's
Yeah.
kind of not really thought about. So every time I've gotten into like a gaming company, it's always been like a hard push, except for the last company that I've been at. So they've been really good about like understanding like the I guess the value of having user experience design, and like looking at things from like a higher philosophical view too. And that's why I think that I like this so much, is because you're thinking about it from a very broad perspective. You're not just saying like, oh, we're selling these features. Like you're selling a feeling, right? Like
Yeah.
Nike, the reason why Nike can charge double what the second brand can is because they're the number one brand, right? Like people are buying like that gut feeling that they get, that feeling of like, oh, if I wear these shoes, I'm gonna be able to slam dunk, right? Like it's that like
Yeah.
overall like you feel awesome when you put on a pair of Nikes. So it's pretty interesting the way that like that affects our psychology too when we purchase things. And I'm a firm believer in like the next like 5 to 10 years, if you don't have a strong brand, like your company is just going to die, because what's happening is everything's getting decentralized. It's getting very easy for anybody to just kind of like trickle up, right? There's no more gatekeepers. There's no more these guys in these studios that are saying, what ads get put on TV and what ads don't get put on TV. And the only way you're going to stand out is with your brand. So it's such an important thing, and it's only going to be exponentially more important now that everything's getting decentralized.
Just as a kind of follow up to the previous question, but building on what you just said, do you think that designers at the highest level need to also be excellent marketers?
I think that it really, again, this depends on what company you're at. I think understanding marketing and being able to like empathize with marketers, whether you're doing it yourself or there's marketing team. I think that there has to be a side of you that understands that you have to sell this product, right? Like you look at this classic example, Elon talks about it, where there was Tesla, and then there was Edison, right? And you had Tesla that was like he was a genius. He was brilliant. He was like came up with way more original like inventions
Yeah.
than Edison. But guess what? Edison was way better at marketing those ideas, so he brought them to market, and he was able to build this empire and to like light all these cities, right? Whereas like Tesla would have just probably sat in this like laboratory, just kept on creating things, and nobody would have known about him, right? So
Yeah.
it's like there's two sides of that, right? Like you have to like have this push for creativity, but you also have to understand that you need to spread that to other people, and you need to have that understanding of like how to do that thing too, and be able to empathize, with a marketing team or with your end users if you're doing the marketing.
Yeah, and I think that these skills that we're sort of loosely talking about sort of marketing and being a good salesperson, not directly, but being able to convince people that this is the right thing to do, are skills that you need to think creatively about anyway.
Hmm.
Regardless of whether you're a designer or a salesperson or a marketer, you need to have these solutions to how are people going to buy our product, and
Sure.
you need to think more left field and come up
Hmm.
with the solutions that other people aren't going to do, and then you're going to win in air quotes. But that's what everyone's after. And
Right.
I kind of it makes me feel a bit weary when I think about that as a requirement for designers or people in general, because it sort of leads a certain, or is it more attracted to a certain personality type. And I'm wondering whether the people who aren't like that can see themselves succeeding, or how different they have to be to reinvent the industry so it's not like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two directions, right? Like you either have to be able to sympathize with other people or you have to be good at it yourself, I think. And I think it's super incredibly important to even have like you need to have those people that understand the marketing side. So there's really only two paths in my eyes. Is like you either need to outsource it to somebody else or you need to be able to empathize with people and be able to do it yourself too.
Yeah. And that's sort of one of the main components of this role, or being a good employee in general, is collaboration, and
Yeah.
being accepting of the fact that you need other people to help you, and you're not
Mhm.
going to achieve it yourself. You're not going to achieve it just with your team. And again, that point person for strategy and direction alongside other people is what's going to make your company a success.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think on top of that too, to add to that is like, talking about the empathy thing is like understanding that, sometimes you have to listen more than you talk. You have to be able to like hear somebody's side of something, right? You can't just hear something and then immediately just react to that thing and not think about, where they're coming from and only be pushing your ideas. Like that's only going to lead to basically you're going to fail at what you're doing in my opinion, because you're not open to like maybe being wrong or to seeing something a new way or being able to try something new, right? Because everything's changing so fast that we have to be like open to being able to like bring in new input, right? Because it's Instagram right now. Before that it was Facebook. Before that it was MySpace. Before that it was LiveJournal. And you have to know where that attention is, and you have to know where to like listen to people, right? Because like we're kind of getting in that generation where we're now we kind of grew up with the internet. Like at least I like was right on the
Yeah.
threshold. I remember right where the internet came out, and that completely changed everything. And I don't think people have like
Yeah.
calibrated their brains quite to the fact that everything changes so fast. And this skill of being able to listen and to empathize is like so incredibly important. Like and it's gonna get worse, right? I guarantee it. When everybody in the world has phones and access to internet, we're getting close to that already. But when everybody does, like it's just going to get exponentially worse because you're going to have to cut through all those people. And if you're not listening to what people actually want, you're just going to be selling to yourself.
Yeah. Just being more specific about the directoring as a job. Do you think that having that broader scope and those strategy and creative thinking skills are actually more important than having the hands-on tools skills?
You know what? Honestly, part of me does feel that because it's kind of like generating ideas sometimes is a lot harder than executing the ideas. Like being able to live in your mind's eye and to be able to like close your eyes, be able to see something in your head. To me, at least, is a harder skill to like teach people. Something like Photoshop. Like you can literally learn Photoshop in a
Yeah,
weekend if you really,
exactly.
really want to try. Like those skill sets are just like they're throwaways, right? It's Photoshop now. It's going to be whether it's not Photoshop, it's going to be Photoshop like version 200.3 by the time, like later on. So it's always going to be something new you have to learn. And so those skill sets, like, yeah, like you have to know and understand how to use like the basic tool sets. So you know how to like art direct people to say like, hey, we might want to try to do this in Cinema 4D versus in Photoshop and their, really crummy version of like 3D stuff. Like you have to have a basic understanding and be able to speak the language, in my opinion, with like, I mean, it kind of goes back if I rewind a little bit to like web stuff too, right? Like you have to understand coders and you have to understand some code to be able to communicate your designs to them. So if somebody's like, oh, you can't do this thing, you can say like, hey, CSS has this property that allows you to
Yeah.
do, this weird morphing thing with these filters and blah, blah, blah. Like if you have that understanding, you can kind of catch things and be more creative. So I do think you have to have like a level of understanding. I don't think you have to have 100% proficiency, because you can just outsource that stuff, right? Like you don't have to do those things by yourself.
Yeah, more specifically to my own experience as hiring junior designers, I reject or bat back any questions that are about the tools and say, please stop thinking about what tools you need to learn.
Mm-hmm.
It's not important. We can teach you those, or you can learn them in your own time very
Sure.
easily. It's more about how you approach a problem
Mm.
and the solutions that you have for those problems. And you're going to have that as a raw talent,
Yeah.
and we should be allowed to let that flourish.
Yeah, how do you approach that? I'm kind of curious how you kind of approach designers when they do kind of say like, like what tools do I need? How do I get this idea out of my head? Blah blah blah. Like what are some typical questions that you get, and maybe what are some like responses to those questions?
Pretty much what tools should I be using?
Yeah.
Or I've been practicing this tool. Is that okay with you? And I say, don't worry about it. Honestly, it's not
Mm,
important. If that's
sure.
what you want to use to achieve the solution, please go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
But we have our own tools that we use, and you can learn them very quickly.
Yeah.
If what you're using at the moment is, well, most tools are very similar anyway, so you can sort of sidestep to learn what we're doing. Or if
For
there's
sure.
integrations, we can do that. Or I'm not going to reject something. I'll
Mm-hmm.
just coach you along the way to get to the point where you're integrated with our systems.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because every company needs rigidity, and you
Sure.
need to have your own libraries and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And most companies do it slightly differently. But
Mm-hmm.
as long as you're open and not locking yourself into something, you're going to be adaptable to each situation.
Yeah, yeah, and it's funny because it feels like our school system is backwards. It For the past 100 years, we've been teaching people how to build railroads, but instead we
Yeah.
need to teach them how to come up with the idea of a train, right?
Yep.
It's
Exactly.
this weird backwards thing that's happening, and it's why people like me and I'm sure yourself, we learn most of our skills from the internet, right? Like we didn't learn most of our stuff from school. We went on the internet and we're reading about things. We're trying to find what the newest, latest way of like coming up with an idea. Like, is it a mind map? Is it some sort of inspiration board? Is it a mood board? Like, how are people getting these ideas out? Like, those are the things that are, in my opinion, the most important part, because they come up with these higher level ideas that are hard to create in I guess a creative way that kind of like catches people's attention, because anybody can go and like use Photoshop and just learn this stuff, but like the hard stuff, like we were talking about earlier, is coming up with these ideas. So I feel like even school right now is kind of backwards, and it's really interesting to me, because I'm a firm believer that the college system is probably going to die within probably our generation, and the only
Yeah.
colleges that are going to be left are like some of the top tier colleges, because like literally they just teach these weird archaic skills that just nobody is going to use, and then the economy is going to collapse eventually on the back of all this debt. And then what's going to happen? People are going to point to the schools, and they're going to be like, why did I go to school when I had the internet literally in my pocket, and I could have just looked up all this stuff on my own time and learned specifically the things that I needed? Because I can't tell you like how many times I was in school and they tried to teach me print design, and I was like, I don't want to learn print design. I
Mm.
want to learn about like how to come up with an idea, or I want to learn about like user interface. And they're like, what's user interface? I'm like, oh man, this
Yeah.
is it's just
Just
interesting.
for reference, the UK system is very similar. And
Mm,
when I was studying, I was being taught things that were at least 5 years out of date,
sure.
and trying to get an internship or a job based off that very specific niche old hat knowledge was pretty
Yeah.
difficult. And I had to sort of self-teach I was self-teaching at university
Yeah.
to make sure I could do something afterwards. And unfortunately, people who don't do that are getting left behind. So
Absolutely.
back to the question about the tools.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, us in our sort of experienced positions can say, don't worry about it. But when you're in that position, you're thinking, oh man, I really need to learn something. So you can, but again, you said you can go on the internet, you can find out what we're using, you
Yeah.
can practice it in your own time, you can do your own self-initiated projects, and then you can be boosted up by when you do get a shot, do get an internship, or do get an interview somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think the trouble a lot of people are forced into thinking that they need to list all these tools in their CV or their resume
Sure.
and say, hey, I could do all this stuff. It's like, well, yeah, sure. But what are you doing with them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do think that the like certain level of proficiency in certain, industries, like if you're in VFX, like you pretty much need to know probably a 3D program, just to be able to like round yourself out. You need to know After Effects
Yeah.
to be able to do
Yeah.
all this. Like there are base level apps that you do need to learn. But I mean, in the UI world, it's a little bit looser, right? Like you can use Sketch if you
Exactly.
want, you can use Illustrator if you want, you can use Photoshop if you want. They all output the same thing. I can work just as fast in Photoshop as somebody else can in Sketch. It has a few more features and stuff like that too. And I also don't like putting myself in a box of like flat design, which
Yeah.
is it's kind of interesting because I feel like Sketch is like pushing in that direction forever, and like Photoshop
Yeah.
doesn't really put me in that box. So it's kind of nice to be able to kind of like play around with shapes and be able to play around with different ways of designing other than this like very rigid like, okay, you got to do it this way.
Boxes on boxes on boxes.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, like I said, there's like a base level. I think that you have to understand stuff. Like you need to know, at least a program, right? Like you can't sketch everything on paper, right? So I mean, at least now, like there are some apps coming out where you can literally sketch stuff and it will make a UI for you. And I do believe that's the direction a lot of UI design is
Yeah.
going to go. It's going to get very algorithmic, and a lot of our jobs as they exist right now are not going to exist the same way in like 5 to 10 years. And a lot of people
Yeah.
fight me on this, but I'm going to stand my ground. And I think honestly 100% sure that like even my job as like a basic app UI designer, I feel like that's going to get overtaken in a few years because you're going to be able to push this out into like some machine learning. It's going to be able to do all your A/B tests. It's going to have a repository of like 10,000 different UIs, and then it's going to pick the right one because it's tested it and it's thorough, right? And then the humans come through, and this is where I think the human touch is going to be needed. But they're going to come through and be like, we need to push this a little this direction or this a little this direction, and then it's going to get a lot of the hard work out of the way. So it's definitely going to change, and I don't think we're going to see it the same way we see it now, obviously. But yeah, just the
Yeah, we are straddling a very dangerous path of templatizing everything
yeah.
in that with two very strong OSs, iOS and Android,
Mm-hmm.
and then them forcing their own design systems and languages on our own thought processes.
Yeah.
We only really need to think about the flows and the strategy, and you
Sure.
could push an app out in that native style and it'd be a success.
And this is also another interesting thing that so Little Labs is the place that owns Facer. So when we were there, one thing that was really hard for me to adjust to was the speed at which they put everything out at. It was crazy. Like I love polishing stuff. I love making stuff like pixel perfect, and everything is just like fine tuned. And I picked the perfect thing for this thing. And like video games, they kind of let you do that. App design is completely opposite. So it was really interesting how I had to kind of adjust and like let go of a lot of like my like need to have everything pixel perfect or have everything kind of like aligned perfectly, and like I don't know, it was just crazy. And so you have to basically push out a lot of these ideas to test the ideas, and then when one bubbles up to the surface, then you're like, okay, that's a winner, let's spend a little bit more time on that. So it's really smart the way that a lot of these places work. You just sometimes it's a little bit of a gamble too, because if a lot of your ideas aren't landing because maybe you'd spent it's like there's definitely a threshold because you can spend a little, how do I put it? You either don't put enough time into something or you put too much time into it. So there's like a
Yep.
sweet spot in the middle of like, okay, it's polished enough to look good enough for people to want to download, but you haven't polished it to the level where you're like spending 3 weeks on this one like screen or this one section of the app. Like it's like you got like 1 to 2 days to design this thing out and like push it out and then get on to the next thing because you have a list of like 1,000 different things. Because you look at that burn down chart and you're like, if we don't get something that's not that is a hit, I should say, then that burn down chart is pretty scary.
Yeah, I think the product process can be scary for people who are of that mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And my main piece of advice for anyone who's trying to design in that product world is don't get too attached to your work. Be happy to throw
Absolutely.
things away. Be happy to turn something around in half an hour and it work, or spend a week on it because it needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be that flexible and have that curiosity and a desire to learn about the user first and not about what you're thinking is the best thing.
Yeah. Do you remember when that switch happened in you? I'm always curious about that.
I think that because I've mostly worked as the solo designer in companies entire career, I've been forced to be rough and ready,
Right from the
and
get-go.
get things to 80%, because the last 20%, no one really cares apart from you.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
you're gonna get the product out quicker. You're gonna make more sales because of it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, hopefully, and
Yeah.
that last those last little touches can actually prevent something from going live.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. And there's that, what, the 80/20 rule, right? Where like 20% or you get 80% of the output from 20% of the
Yeah,
work too, a lot of
yeah,
times. I think that's how it goes. You guys might have to fact check that. But there's something where basically you don't have to put as much time into something as you think you do. Like a lot of times you should just put more volumes of things out and then test those things, see what works, and then loop those back in. And that's kind of the way that I've been approaching a lot of my Instagram accounts. So like
yeah,
one of them gets something like 3 million views in a week. Like it's insane. And it's because I've done this testing approach where I put all this content out. I was putting up to like 10 posts a day at one point. I figured out which ones were doing the best. And then I just started posting again back to like once a day because it tend to work best that way. But I figured out which posts were the ones that were doing well. And the app world is the same way, right? Like you put all these apps out and you see which one kind of hits. If one is like, catching more attention than one of the other ones, then you kind of like work on that one and you keep building it up. And sometimes it's, your original idea. That's kind of what happened with Facer, is like Facer, the app itself was like the strongest one. And so they refocused on that. And that ended up being like, I guess the one, the one that was like doing the best. So
yeah. You've got to also be very mindful that you've got incremental value. The more work you produce, the better your decision making gets. The more you
absolutely.
can rely on the historical success of all your decisions, and then you're ultimately going to be able to do things a lot quicker, a lot faster, and mentor people based off your experience. And that's what brings you back to this creative strategist, creative director role, because
Mm-hmm.
you've seen it, you've seen
Yep.
what works based on real things.
Yeah, and this is like the biggest mistake that I feel like new designers make is they don't output enough crappy design that like they basically don't put out enough concepts, right? That's like number one
Yeah,
mistake. Just put out 100 of them. We understand, like as creative directors and art directors, that you're not going to be putting out Facebook level design on every single one. You just got to put out 100 of them because the first 99 are going to be terrible, and then number 100 is going to be the one that is going to be like the winner. Or you'll pull something out of number 100 and bring it into number 50 or number
yes,
60 too.
yeah. It's that it goes back to what I was saying about being happy to let things go,
Mm-hmm.
and your first version in your mind is perfect. But
Absolutely.
once you've got real data in there, once the real people have seen it, that's going to have to change, I'm afraid.
Yeah,
Regardless of whether it looks great or not, it
absolutely.
works, and it's live.
In a really good
And
way. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, really quickly, a really good way of being able to test this is like, if you're a designer out there, just do 100 designs. And then when you get to 100, look at design number one. And I guarantee you, every single one of you is going to look at number one and be like, wow, what was I thinking? Even though you thought
Yeah,
that was the best one. And it always
yeah,
happens.
yeah. And I was just looping it back to something we've sort of touched on a few times, that all these skills about judgment and working towards the future and incremental value and all this kind of stuff for someone at senior level as a designer. These skills are really difficult to prove or to get down on paper,
Mm-hmm.
but it's sort of a feeling that you get, and it ultimately informs your confidence in your work.
Sure.
And it does actually make writing your resume pretty hard as someone who has experience, because most people actually just judge you on the pixels.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
sort of an industry problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is actually possibly why a lot of design hiring is done by networking and done by referrals, just because you
Sure.
know someone's skills. Because I know that you've done a lot of work through referrals in the past,
Oh, yeah.
but
Like 90% of my jobs are from people that knew me. So
well,
100%.
exactly. But that hasn't forced you to maintain a consistent online portfolio or anything. People who have worked with you know you're good, and they know you've got the skills, so they can rely on you.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just super important to just have those connections, and that's why we're kind of doing this podcast too, right? Like we want to be able to like meet more people and to be able to be inspired by like the things that they do and to be able to learn like the stuff that they've learned and be able to share that stuff. Because I feel like a lot of people just hoard that stuff. They find these things that work and they're like, I'm not going to share it with anybody, you know, like I'm going to keep this to myself, because if somebody knows my secret and, you know, I tell it to other people, then everybody's going to copy. Like, no, that's like, if somebody steals your idea and does it better than you, you deserve to lose, in my opinion. Because
hard hitting,
like 100%, because you should be able to like take that and be able to do 10 other home runs, because these other people are going to be going and copying you. They're going to spend, you know, like a month trying to do what you just did. And by then you're already coming up with like 10 new ideas. You're like way ahead of them. Right. And this happened with Facer. I'm going to leave the other app, you know, unnamed, but there was another app that basically literally every single time we came out with a new feature within like a week to two, like I would say like a 1 to 3 weeks maybe ish, they would have that exact same feature. And it was just like,
me that actually.
Yeah, and the brand of Facer I think was stronger, and that's why they're still winning right now, is they're doing better because they're coming up with the ideas. They're not copying anybody's ideas. They're coming up with these ideas from like a business side and from like a strategic side and from an art side, right? Like they're not just going and saying what's like hot over here or what's hot over here and we're just going to steal this thing, you know?
Yeah. All right, I've just got one final question for you. It's a big one. Without this role or without this ethos in companies, do you think that those who neglect the importance of it are deprioritizing design as an important thing in the industry?
Sorry, so what specifically? The brand side?
So a company that doesn't have a creative director role, doesn't have a lead designer role, is that a detriment to the broader industry that they're working in?
I mean, I think it can be. I think some people naturally just understand creative direction and just understand how to like push a product a certain way. And so in essence, they're kind of doing what a creative director would do. But I firmly believe that you need somebody that thinks at that level, like a hired brand, like cohesive level. And this sometimes, like, you know, a lot of times I would defer to like my boss and see, you know, like which was the owner, and see like what he thought about things too. Like he did a lot of the creative direction side too. So I'd kind of bounce ideas off of him. I'd go to the product manager. I'd bounce ideas off of them too. So I 100% do believe that you need somebody that thinks in that way. You don't necessarily need a creative director, but you need a creative direction mindset, if that makes any sense. You need to be able to look at it that like 10,000 foot view, because everybody works differently, right? Not everybody can afford a creative director. Like it, you know, costs a lot of money to hire somebody specifically to just be doing like that style of work too. So I don't think it's absolutely necessary, but you do need somebody that thinks in that way.
I'm glad we have the same opinion. I was sort of leaning on we need somebody, because it's very comfortable for us as designers to say, yeah, you need us in your business. But the reality is, as you said, it's expensive to hire someone to focus specifically on this kind of thing.
Sure.
And it's the businesses that succeed just have that creative flair from the outset and know how to solve problems in a creative way, not necessarily how to push pixels around the screen.
Absolutely.
It's how can we get more customers? Who can we target to get more partnerships and clients? And how can we market ourselves better? You need these solutions for these problems to be creative.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately the goal of that role anyway.
Yeah, and we're like a half step from being psychologists too. It's kind of interesting when you think about it.
Or manipulators.
Yeah. I don't know if I want to call myself a manipulator, but
VP. Yeah, that was it. That was my last question.
Cool.
That was really cool.
All right. Well, thanks for chatting with me. It was really fun talking about Facer. So I just want to do a quick little plug for Facer because they're super awesome and they're helping support us right now. You guys, if you are a designer, you should definitely check out Facer. They have partner programs, so you can kind of like design watch faces, make some money off of them. And if you make it into the partner program, I think that basically like you just get a percentage of those sales and stuff too. So yeah, definitely check out Facer. Oh, so you can go to facer.io is their website. That's one of the places you can go to. You can download it on Android. You can download it on iOS. You can download it on the Samsung store, which I was trying to think of what the name was. Kind of brain farting there for a second. So they're basically on Tizen. They're on Android Wear. They're on iOS. They're on all the platforms.
Great. Thank you very much.
You got it. All right. Take it easy. It was fun. All right. Thanks so much for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed that one. We just wanted to ask you one quick favor. We work crazy hard to bring the guests on and all the work that goes with it. We only ask you two things. The first one, if you aren't already subscribed, please hit that subscribe button, whatever platform you're using. We're pretty much on all the platforms. And second is to just share it with somebody you think would enjoy it. That's all. It would mean so much to us. Thanks, everybody. Peace.